Great. So just let me share my screen. Thank you. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So today my talk will be on the world after Mountain View High School. I went to Mountain View High School. I graduated here in 2009. Really loved my time here. I thought, the teachers here were really great. And so were a lot of my classmates. I had a really great time. The main activity I was involved in here was speech and debate. The speech and debate team, my year, we were really privileged with having some really wonderful coaches who 3 years before had won the Tournament of Champions nationally. And so they really coached us to become great debaters, gain confidence. And that was really kind of my community here in Mountain View High School. But at the same time, one of the treats I had here at Mountain View was that I actually had some family who went here as well. So my cousin Ariana, who's actually in the audience, she went here. She was actually in my year. And I'm sure many of the teachers remember her. My cousin Sarah Kashani, Ariana's sister, also went here. And then my brother Ryan went here. And he was actually the ASB president. So he was even more distinguished here than I was at Mountain View High School. And I'm sure many of the teachers fondly remember both my cousins and him. And so from Mountain View High School, really my passion for debate, but also my interest in foreign policy developed from debate, because many of the topics that we were competing about, the resolutions were on really pressing foreign policy matters, like how to deal with countries that are acquiring nuclear weapons, how to deal with the economic relationships between countries, or how to deal with international criminal law. These are some of the topics that we were debating, and that at Mountain View High School, the research skills that I was learning actually helped me debate those topics. And for me, growing up here in the Bay Area as a child of immigrants, like I'm sure many people here at Mountain View High School are, inevitably, I was very interested in international relations and foreign policy. So my talk today is going to be about two things. First, I'm going to talk about my journey and how I got involved in foreign policy. I went to Stanford University, and between Stanford and law school, I spent 6 years gaining both academic and professional experience in foreign policy. So I'm going to talk about my journey and also what you can do as students who are about to step into a really interesting world after Mountain View High School with a lot of pressing challenges. And the second thing I'm going to do is actually talk about some of the ways of thinking about different foreign policy challenges. I'm not going to advocate for any one policy or another, but I'm going to focus on talking about the way and the framework of thinking about some of these issues so that you can apply it on your own and then be able to defend multiple sides of any argument. So a little bit about me. So as I mentioned, I went to Stanford University, was really lucky there in the sense that I had some really wonderful mentors, but things didn't just fall in my lap. Really, I had to work hard for them. And at Mountain View, it was one thing I learned that was really important was gaining the confidence to actually go and reach out to mentors and seek mentors, get to know my teachers, sometimes stay after class and ask questions. And really engage with the material. And I took the same lesson to Stanford University, where two of the mentors I have here, one, Dr. Bill Perry, who was the former Secretary of Defense for Bill Clinton, and former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. So professors and teachers from both parties who really helped me develop. And one of the things I did in Stanford, in addition to studying international relations and gaining coursework there, was also go and get hands-on experience. So while I was there, I interned at both the U.S. mission to the United Nations, when Ambassador Susan Rice was the UN ambassador there, and then also the U.S. Department of Treasury's Middle East North Africa office. So both on the economic side of foreign policy and also the diplomacy side. And that was really awesome because I really was able to get kind of a front row seat to some of the major foreign policy issues happening at that time, in addition to my classes. And again, these weren't things that just came and fell in my lap. I had to go out and apply to this through the State Department website, through the U.S. Treasury's website, and really put yourself out there to find those roles. And after my education, there I went and worked at a think tank where I was a foreign policy research analyst, helping lead the Harvard Belfer Center's China working group and China team for Graham Allison, who was the founding dean of the Harvard Kennedy School. So a lot of my mentors come from many different parts of the political spectrum. And really the focus here isn't on politics, but on policy. And so that's a picture on the far right with my boss, Graham, when we went to a conference in China together. And then in addition to work experience and actually like taking courses on international relations, one of the most important things to do is actually to study abroad. So here we have the different places I went to abroad. The first one here, it's Oxford, England. Then here is in Seoul, right beneath that, South Korea. This tower, the red tower, that's in Tokyo. The picture on the right, the top corner, right corner, is Beijing, where I did a master's degree in economics in China. And then this picture here is a picture of the Silk Road, which I had the chance of traveling to. Now, one thing all these places have in common is that I went to all of them for free. I applied to grants, I applied to scholarships, and really did research to get to these places, whether it be conferences, study abroad opportunities, and whether or not your school has a huge, robust study abroad program. Even if it doesn't, there are a lot of conferences you can apply to. There are institutions that provide grants. So that really helped me kind of get a broader global perspective. And one of the teachers at Mountain View High School who I really have to credit with kind of instilling with me a passion for traveling and global issues was Senor Morgan, Jeff Morgan, who he always talked about how much he loved to travel and how important that was to him. And I kind of took that and ran with it. So that's what it was. And then so basically, my next slide is, what is foreign policy? So I want to open this up to the audience. If anyone, has a definition of what foreign policy is, or you want to describe it, I think it'd be nice to make this as interactive as possible.
Hi, Daniel. Very nice to meet you.
Hello.
To me, foreign policy means whatever is beneficial for that country and how they frame it within the global world.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think looking at some of the interests and looking at the global context, I think that's very right. Yeah, so I think foreign policy is that. It's also a few other things. It's controversial. Foreign policy is one of the most divisive and controversial topics that are out there. That's out there. It leads to protests, leads to arguments, many different sides, many different ideas. And one of the unique features of actually doing foreign policy as a field, like let's say you're a chemist, you're not going to have everyone having an opinion on chemistry. And if someone has a PhD in chemistry and is a Nobel laureate, there's like a barrier of entry in order to debate with that person. But with foreign policy, the difference is that anyone can have an opinion about it. So you can be an ambassador to China with a PhD, and then somebody who has no experience in foreign policy but has read the news can come and debate with you. And that's both a good and bad thing. It's good in the sense that it democratizes the issue so that more people have access to it. But at the same time, it actually makes it more difficult because if anyone can form an opinion about it and debate with it, and sometimes people are operating on different sets of facts, it becomes actually very divisive. So that's one of the big challenges with foreign policy to tackle, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. It is controversial. And one of the other factors is, as a nation, that is a nation where many people are immigrants. We're a nation of immigrants. We're also a nation of slaves, and we're also a nation of Native Americans. It's many different groups. Foreign policy, if your heritage is from many different countries, you're in a country where we're basically blending many different life experiences. So as a result of that, that's beneficial in the sense that we get many different voices. It also makes it very controversial in the sense that there's going to be a lot of debate and division that we have to reconcile. And the next thing that is hard. This picture here is where the Allied forces are storming the beaches of Normandy. It's very hard. It's very important in the sense that a lot of the decisions that are made by foreign policy decision makers are questions of life or death, are questions of the survival of different countries and their allies. And here we actually have a picture of the Reagan administration in the height of the Cold War. In the Situation Room, you have President Reagan. Flanked on his right is, or on his left, is former Secretary of State George Shultz, who actually passed away this weekend and was one of the greatest secretaries of state recognized across both parties. And then here in the Obama administration, during the bin Laden raid, imagine how monumental of a decision that was to go in. And you can almost see him carrying the weight of his presidency on his shoulders in that picture. So regardless of political party or political persuasion, one of the best quotes on foreign policy I've heard is politics ends at the water's edge. And sometimes that's true, sometimes it isn't, but you can actually empathize with any leader who's in these positions who has to create those decisions. And it's not just here within the US. We make decisions here within our own country, and then we take those decisions out into the global arena, here being the UN Security Council right beneath that. So we have layers of decisions that have to be made. And the next thing is that foreign policy is important. As I mentioned, these are questions of life or death. They're questions of global stability, and also in terms of negotiating with great powers. Here you have Dr. Condoleezza Rice, my mentor, staring down Vladimir Putin. And then here with President Reagan with Gorbachev. And then Bill Clinton trying to build peace between Israel and Palestine, and Secretary Clinton with Xi Jinping. So this is an important issue that both parties, that everyone has to deal with. So then the question that I think many people ask when confronted with a foreign policy challenge is, what matters? What matters to you? So I'll open it up to the audience if anyone wants to say, like, what foreign policy issue, like what's something that matters to you?
I would hope that other people have the same opinion, but peace, like global peace, lack of conflict.
Totally, that's great. Thank you, Avi. Anyone else?
More collaboration and less competition.
Great, thank you so much.
Open-mindedness.
Great. Yeah, all of those things are correct, and they all matter. And one of the challenges with foreign policy is that so many things matter. How do you deal with all of them at the same time? And so I think the better question to ask is not what matters. And what people usually ask in foreign policy decision making, just what matters. And oftentimes the public expects them to tackle everything. But I think a better question is, what matters more than something else that matters? And really the job of foreign policymakers is to prioritize issues that are oftentimes in tension and oftentimes competing. And part of the reason for this is that policy is made by imperfect people. So unlike a calculus BC test for Mr. McGurk, right, where there's like a right answer and you have to work and show your work, you get to the right answer. Here, oftentimes in foreign policy, you have imperfect people making imperfect solutions with oftentimes imperfect ideas. So really, it's a study in ambiguity. It's very different than some of the things in some of the different fields we're used to in school. And so this is actually a framework that I hope many of you will find useful in thinking about some of these different issues, which I actually worked on with my former boss, Graham Allison, at the Harvard Kennedy School, which is a hierarchy of interests. And actually many different leaders in national security and the US military use this framework, which is separating out what your interests are. Anytime you're dealing with a problem and confronting it, it's best to look at how does that problem implicate different hierarchies of interests. So vital, the center one means strictly for your survival. So one of you mentioned how foreign policy is looking at the interests of a country in the context of global affairs. And that is absolutely correct. And starting with what is vital. So what is necessary for your survival. And then next is what is important. And so important is more about your well-being. So examples of that are your national prosperity, your institutions remaining strong and vibrant and continuing those. And peripheral are things that are good to have, but not absolutely necessary. And so we have this hierarchy of interest. Many people have different opinions about this, and that's totally fine. But what I'm encouraging you here maybe is to kind of use this in thinking about different problems and kind of organizing thoughts. No matter where you fall in terms of a political spectrum or arguments, this is something that I often use to kind of resolve debates and disagreements that I have with people. And then another kind of framework that I use is taking into account past examples of events. So for instance, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy famously went and looked at, past historical examples, such as the appeasement of the Nazis by Britain, or looking at other historical examples like what led to World War II. And obviously those are imperfect analogies because nuclear weapons didn't exist then. But the purpose here is to get you thinking about both sides of arguments and also seeing how historical analogs are similar and different. So this is something that I often use, which is taking a piece of paper, drawing a line down the middle, and putting similarities on one side and differences on the other. Another one is taking an argument and putting a list of things that are for and against them. So it's often very important anytime you have a policy issue to think about counter arguments to it. It's not just good enough to say, okay, these are my ideas, this is what we're going to do, and to debate with passion, but also look at the greatest weaknesses you have in your argument and to look at the other side. Because if you can't understand the other side, your argument becomes weaker. And maybe the other side has some grains of truth in it. And by other side, I mean the people who are against the specific policy that you're thinking of advocating for. General Stanley McChrystal, one of the things that he's been pioneering has been something called red teaming, where you actually have members of the same team taking a challenge and you divide the team up where you have one team called the blue team, where they go and advocate for something. And then the red team goes and finds all the weaknesses in that argument. And so this is a skill that I learned from debate, but also some of the best leaders in national security use. And then the final one is cooperation and competition. So one of you mentioned that less competition is important in international affairs. And while cooperation is the thing that we definitely want to move to, one of the challenges of international relations is that nations inevitably compete. Because even if you're not competing with a country, another country might be competing with you. But maybe the best way to kind of tackle that is to think, what areas can we specifically cooperate on? And what areas can we specifically compete on? And that we will. So an example, which I will get to later, is dealing with the current US-China relationship, where you have many people on both sides saying, let's have be tough on China. I personally don't understand what that means, but taking tough on China and then putting it on this page, you'll soon realize that policy that's not really a policy, that's just a slogan. The more kind of thoughtful approach would be to say, well, actually, what are the interests that we share with China? One is on climate change, so we can cooperate there. Another one is currently containing the COVID crisis, so we can cooperate there, but maybe competing on intellectual property theft. So trying to find the different areas there that we can end up competing on. Then the other thing that I think is really important is in Mountain View High School, somebody once told me, like a friend of mine before we graduated, he said, I forgot everything I learned. Nothing I learned, I'm gonna remember and take with me in the rest of my life. And I listened to it, I thought it was really interesting because they said, oh, I'm gonna specialize and then go, do chemical engineering and forget about everything I learned except Dr. T's Chem AP class. That actually, and for me, turned out to be completely false. Every single thing I studied at Mountain View High School, every class I had actually ended up being useful in dealing with international relations, in studying foreign policy. So I mentioned Mr. McGurk's calculus class earlier and how that's different. But the thing I learned from that class was how to think systematically about problems, break them down into different pieces. The other thing is that math is important when you're dealing with economics and business relations between countries. You have to know about math. That's not something that you can forget. So foreign policy, one of the interesting things about it, and the discipline of foreign policy, international relations, political science, is that it is related to so many different disciplines. So it's related to economics, because if you're thinking about how to engage in trade with countries, economics matters. It's related to business, because sometimes you have multinational corporations that are in both your country and in another country, or countries are trying to invest in each other. Science and technology, drawing from your science classes, from biotech, from chemistry, from physics, that all matters. It matters in terms, not just in terms of whether countries are going and modernizing their weapons technology. It matters in terms of science and innovation, and that. So don't forget about your science classes. In a lot of the work I did at the Harvard Kennedy School, I was actually going and researching nuclear proliferation, and I was going and looking back at my notes from Chem AP on fission and fusion. Military and intelligence. Countries inevitably have militaries, they have intelligence systems. So you can't ignore those things because they're a fact of life and they exist. And it's really important to understand them. Geography and culture. Oftentimes you can look at a map and kind of get a sense of what a country's interests are based on its location, which many people don't do. Many people will read the news and kind of create maybe stereotypes or biases about or assumptions about a country's behavior. But oftentimes, if you look at their geography, if you travel to the country, get a sense of their culture, it's very helpful indicator to you of what challenges and interests they might have. For instance, a country that is landlocked cares less about having a navy than a country that is right on the water. So that stuff matters. History matters too. The history classes I took at Mountain View, I think were with Miss Hancock, with Miss Hellman, and Mr. Blasquez, were I think some of the most important classes that I had. So Henry Kissinger famously said that history is the soul of a nation. And I think that, that's true. History tells you, is a good indicator of what is about to come, of what is going to happen in the future, as long as you're willing to learn from it and also look at the differences between history and the present. So oftentimes you'll have people going and making policy prescriptions about a country that they don't know nothing about, that they haven't studied the history of. So in there, I encourage some humility in terms of learning about countries and learning about their history, because many countries, actually, their history is much longer than ours. And that's very valuable for us as American citizens, I think, to learn. Also, literature and language. Language is very valuable in the sense that it pierces the barriers between people. And so the classes that you may be taking at Mountain View, whether it be Japanese, Spanish, French, or whatever else they're teaching at Mountain View, those were kind of the main ones when I was there. I don't know if that's been updated, but language matters a lot, and so does literature. Oftentimes, some of the best diplomats in the Cold War, they'd be seen walking around with books of Shakespeare or different books about history or literature, because literature is unbounded and it's very creative. And if you want to make creative solutions in foreign policy, that's something important to look at. And then finally, philosophy, law, and diplomacy. are all linked, and I think law and diplomacy are a bit obvious. Law for treaties, diplomacy for negotiating with countries. But philosophy, I think, matters a lot too, because foreign policy is really about the philosophy of history. The decisions that a foreign policy maker makes affects the course of history and the outcomes there. So now I wanted to get into the world. So I haven't included the Latin American continent or the African continent because I'm not experts in those areas and I don't purport to be. But where I kind of wanted to focus on the rest of this talk is applying some of these frameworks to seeing kind of the challenges that are affecting the new administration. As I said, I'm not going to advocate for any policies or any specific views, but I'm going to, use these frameworks to kind of think about the challenges that are will confront the new administration. So here we have Russia. So Russia is one of the most important countries in the sense that it is a great power. Russia, even though the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended in 1991, Russia's nuclear arsenal didn't go away. So it has thousands of nuclear weapons that almost equal in number to the ones that we have here in the United States. And so it is a very important relationship. So one of you mentioned that what matters is avoiding war or having peace. Well, that's inevitably important with a country like Russia, because a war between the US and Russia would be devastating for both sides. At the same time, there are interests that we have in the US that that in Russia, the government specifically may not have. So for instance, right now there is a division over what to do with Mr. Navalny, who is a protester against President Putin. And so that's an area that there may be competition, and you will probably see competition between the Biden administration and Russia on. And then other areas for potential collaboration are in the technology sector, on the economic sector, and kind of building ties between the US and Russia so as to kind of quell the tension that exists between the two countries. But at the same time, we also have to stand up for our allies that are in NATO. And that's something that the Biden administration cares about significantly. So as you can see, it's not a perfect solution where some people will say, oh, this person's tough on Vladimir Putin, or this person has to be tough on Russia. That's not good enough. I think the best kind of foreign policy, a way of thinking about foreign policy, is still to draw the line down the middle and say, this is where we cooperate, this is where we compete, and to actually delve into the nuances and complexities of those relationships. So the other great challenge will be China. So China doesn't have as many nuclear weapons as Russia does. China has 200. But once you're at that scale in terms of nuclear weapons capability, that's enough to deter a country that has thousands of nuclear weapons. It doesn't matter because nuclear weapons are incredibly dangerous, and that capability that they have is enough to basically wipe out the United States if there is a conflict. President Reagan famously said, a nuclear war can never be won and therefore must never be fought. And I think that that is a very valid statement in dealing with both the US-Russia relationship and the US-China relationship. So, but what is really important with China is looking at the economics between the US and China and the relationship there. So this is a picture that I worked on with my boss at the Harvard Kennedy School, Graham Allison, in his book, The Thucydides Trap. And this picture basically shows how China's economy has grown. And basically by 2024, China's economy is projected to be 1.5 times larger than that of the United States. So here you can actually see, we talked about China, we talked about Russia. One of the greatest challenges I think that the United States can face and the Biden administration might face is if Russia and China become closer together, if we're too antagonistic to both countries simultaneously. And that can lead to a problem because if Russia is a nuclear superpower and China is an economic superpower, then that seesaw that you're seeing here, if you put Russia on China's side, it doesn't look too good for us in terms of that balance of power. So there, in terms of building better relations with countries, that's something that's important, is to work on diplomacy with both Russia and China so the two of them don't become too close together. Another great challenge I think that the Biden administration is going to face is North Korea. So North Korea, since President Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump, North Korea has gone on a steady nuclear advance and has enhanced its technology and enhanced its capability, and almost was on the precipice of doing enough testing during the Trump administration to develop an intercontinental ballistic missile that could reach the United States. Luckily, that has been halted, but we can see this tension, potentially emerge again under the Biden administration if we're not careful and don't engage diplomatically with North Korea. So that's one challenge there. And then Iran. So Iran is, I would say, one of the most politicized issues and controversial foreign policy issues. But nevertheless, Iran is an incredibly important country in terms of its history, has 2,500 years of history, very rich culture, but is also located in probably the crossroads of Eurasia. Very important in the sense that on the eastern side of Iran, you have Central Asia, and on the western side, you have the rest of the Middle East. So it's incredibly important right now, the nuclear issue and the tensions that the US and Iran are facing. And here I encourage you to also look at that circle that I had earlier in terms of what are vital interests, what are important interests, and what are peripheral interests for the United States, and then do that same list for Iran and for also all the other countries I mentioned there. But lastly, we come here to the United States. So one of President Biden's kind of top foreign policy items has been creating a foreign policy for the middle class. And that's kind of been the banner and the slogan. But they're basically saying that domestic policy here at home, what we do here at home affects foreign policy, and foreign policy affects domestic policy. And I think that's important in terms of thinking about the different items and issues that the Biden administration is dealing with, whether it be COVID, whether it be immigration, whether it be China policy, thinking about how that affects us here at home. So that's kind of the main gist of my talk on those issues and on current events. As you can see, my whole idea here was to really just give you a framework for thinking about these issues rather than advocating for one viewpoint or another. And so I made a list of 8 things that you can do as students who are thinking about where to go to college, if you're interested in international affairs, or once you're in college, what you can do. So the first is to try out coursework in international relations. So I actually, when I got to Stanford, I started off doing computer science. And in Silicon Valley, that's the thing people do, right? And it's lucrative, it's great. And if you love computer science, do computer science. But I hated it. It was not something I could do. I can't imagine myself sitting down and coding. It's not something I like. So I just didn't do it. And then I tried economics, kind of like that. But really, my passion was international relations. And I encourage you to find out what that is, try out different courses, sit in on different lectures. And ultimately, if you do something that you're passionate about, you will be successful in it. The second is to seek out mentors. Research assistantships is very important. Finding professors, asking if you can do research for them. And it doesn't even have to be at your university. You can reach out to people at other universities and see if you can become part of their research and to learn more about these issues. And then the third one is internships. As I mentioned earlier, I had the privilege of interning at the US mission to the United Nations. When you're in college, you can apply to internships as well, whether it be government or whether it be local or state. Some of you might already be doing internships in high school. But I think in college, it's really important to get that experience so that when you are applying for jobs, you can not just have academic experience, but you have internships. The fourth is to study abroad. If your school doesn't have a really good study abroad program that maybe is extensive, you can find conferences abroad. So you don't have to just do it through your school. The fifth is to apply for grants, research grants and scholarships to go abroad. There's money, many universities have money lying around in different places. You just have to go find it. And I'm not just talking about private universities, public ones do as well. And I have many friends at many kinds of universities who've gone and whether they've sold art or whether they've gone and volunteered places or whether they've gone and done, car washes or whatever to raise money so that they can travel. The sixth is seeking mentors. Mentors oftentimes don't come to you. You have to go to them. You have to reach out to them. The seventh one is regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, get involved, get active. You can work on political campaigns. If there's someone you want to work for or someone who inspires you, volunteer. And I'm sure many of you have done that before. And the eighth is to believe in yourself. Do not ever give up. Don't let anyone tell you that you're not good enough. You can do it. And then lastly, stay in touch with your classmates, because oftentimes your classmates, when you're working or whatever, don't just focus on the people above you. Oftentimes people think if you focus on the people who are your bosses or your mentors, that they're the ones who are going to get you jobs. But oftentimes the people who, really help you in your career, the people who you went to high school with, or you went to college with, or you interned with. So don't forget about your peers. But also just for the sake of it, like you develop friendships at Mountain View High School, sometimes are lifelong. This picture, you're probably wondering, what is that? That's my 10th year Mountain View High School anniversary, which happened last November before COVID, not this past one, the one before. And in terms of, I've talked a lot about foreign policy decision-making and careers and all of that, but don't let your career get in the way of life. My father always told me, you have to, you shouldn't live to work, you should work to live. And so for me, I've talked a lot about decision-making, but recently this past summer, this is the best decision I made, which is I proposed to my fiance, who's actually here on this call. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much. I'll open it up to questions if anyone has any.
I've got a couple of questions if you don't mind.
Sure.
One question I have is, I know you talked about like a couple of countries that you know a lot about. How did you choose which regions you wanted to specialize in and focus on primarily?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. So, Avi, where are you in Los Altos? Are you in Mountain View High School?
I'm in Mountain View.
Mountain View. What year are you, may I ask?
I'm a senior.
Okay, awesome. So you're about to start college soon.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think for me, the way I chose was I had kind of a weird path. So I came into college and I thought to myself, among the countries that I'm really interested in, I'm naturally interested in Iran because I'm Iranian American. And so I knew a lot about Iran growing up. And then I decided to study Iran in school. And actually, when I studied in school and read different material, it kind of shattered some of the assumptions I had growing up, because I was now looking at it from the perspective of an academic and a scholar, rather than from the perspective of somebody whose heritage is just Iranian. And so that kind of made me help me think about these issues, but also made me interested in other countries. So I studied Iran. I studied kind of the diplomacy toward Iran. And that made me interested in the similarities and differences in our diplomacy with North Korea. So I got interested in North Korea and nuclear weapons issues. And then after that, I realized, China is really important as well. Like you can't understand foreign policy toward North Korea or Iran without understanding China, since China is one of Iran's largest trading partners. And almost, I think 80 to 90% of North Korea's economy is reliant on China. And also now the relationship between China and the US. And then when I was working for my boss, Graham, at Harvard, he was an expert on the Cold War. And actually had worked in government for Reagan and Bill Clinton. He's a very bipartisan guy. And so I studied with him and got really interested in Russia as well. So that's how I ended up with those four. And I think most foreign policy analysts or national security analysts would argue that those four countries, the US has had kind of a lot of challenges with them. And so they're really important. But I also think that, there's so many other countries that are important. Look at Myanmar right now and what's going on there. That's really crucial. And thinking about how that was going on, as well as the events on January 6th here in the United States, and thinking about the parallels, what happens here and what's happening abroad. So not forgetting about that. And I'm interested in every country. because every country matters. Remember my question, like what matters? But in terms of what I specialize in, I think these are the four that I was most interested in. Thank you. Any other questions?
So you mentioned that after studying about Iran and foreign policy, your perception changed because you looked at countries not because of your heritage or because where you're citizen of or where you live, but rather from the strategic point of view. So can you share one or two of those experiences you have had?
Yeah, so I think here's an example. I think I have Iran, as you might appreciate, is such a politicized country, like in terms of our politics about it here in the United States. And there's so many controversies about it. And as a result, many people who I know, like friends and kind of like family friends and stuff, have like conspiracy theories, right? And so for me, like if you're hearing a ton of opinions about what happened in the events in Iran, like 1979, right? Like, so for instance, some people say, accuse President Carter of, bringing the current regime in Iran. Well, if you read archival material and the primary sources, that's not exactly what happened. And so like, that's an example I'm saying of like, hearing things because of just my background and that versus actually going and studying the issues and reading the books and listening to professors from diverse perspectives. And that's actually what I want to encourage most is listening to diverse perspectives, whether they be Democrat or Republican or independent, just like getting yourself out there to listen to those ideas, because either you'll learn something new or it'll, and this is for the students really, it's like you'll learn something new or strengthen your own opinion or your own arguments. And so that's actually something that I found very helpful in terms of becoming more open-minded and being able to distinguish kind of conspiracy theory from fact. Thank you.
I've
Any
got
other
another
questions?
question, if you
Yeah,
don't mind.
sure.
It's a bit more specific, but I'm on the debate team, and something that I've had to debate about for a while now is China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I think like it's heavily like there's a bunch of different narratives that I keep hearing about it. And I wonder like, what's your opinion on like how much of a challenge that actually poses to the US in the future?
So that's a fantastic question, and that's one that I'm very interested in. So the Belt and Road Initiative, as I mentioned, I traveled the Silk Road, basically from Greece to India, and then lived in China. So I'll make two responses to that. So one is, I think a book that my friend just wrote, one of my colleagues at the Harvard Kennedy School, Ike Freeman, just wrote a book where he claims it's kind of like the authoritative account of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I would look at that. But the second point, which I think is one of the arguments that he makes, and something that I believe as well, which is that the Belt and Road Initiative, and for those of you who don't know, that's basically an initiative that President Xi Jinping, China's leader, announced that China will basically build, revitalize the old Silk Road and build better trading relationships, foreign direct investment, and development with other countries in Central Asia, all the way into Europe. And he has ports in Greece. You even look at some of the African nations where China is involved in, like Sudan. And then there's the Maritime Belt and Road Initiative where they're doing it on the sea. So in terms of what threat that poses to the United States, many commentators will say, oh, China is expanding its influence. It's like a Marshall Plan. It's really not. If you look at the amount of money that China is pouring into this versus the Marshall Plan, that's not sufficient. What's really important is looking at what was the Marshall Plan for and what is the Belt and Road Initiative for. The Belt and Road Initiative seems to be more of a banner and more of kind of like a unifying slogan. It's very ambiguous in many ways, and that's strategic so that no matter what happens to it, it can't fail, right? Because they haven't outlined the criteria for success. But on the other hand, if China is building economic relations with these countries and China wants to expand and build projects, let's say in Iran, I think one, it's not that big of a threat to the US because China actually doesn't have the experience that, let's say, other empires did in terms of managing other countries. So that didn't work out so well for the Soviet Union. I don't think it'll work out well for China. So my suggestion is, one, let them do it, and two, the US could be part of it. In the sense that with economics, there's no reason to be mutually exclusive. So I hope that answers your question. I'm more than happy to talk about it offline if you're interested as well.
That does, thank you.
Yeah, any other questions?
I've got one more if that's fine. I don't know. This is really interesting to me.
Sure.
But there's another thing about China is that we also debate a bunch about like the South China Sea, and people always like impact it out to like huge like US-China war because of like China instigating in terms of like getting rid of like freedom of navigation, all of the artificial island building, and I honestly can't tell like to what degree is that actually a problem? Like all of this like island building that China is doing, is it actually posing any sort of like international threat?
Yeah, so you can look at that chart that I had, like those circles: vital, important, peripheral, right? And I guess I would challenge you, where would you place that? You know, where do you think, as a debater, where would you put that in terms of the threat?
I'd say like for the US, at least from what I've seen, like between peripheral and important, but for countries within that region that need to use that, like you need to use the sea for like maritime trade, I would say like peripheral up to important.
Yeah, so I
But
agree with
important
that.
to vital, yeah.
Yeah, so I agree with that. It's oftentimes one of the biggest challenges that we have is actually alliance management and dealing with our allies. And there was a famous British defense secretary who said it takes like 10 times more effort to reassure an ally than to deter an adversary. And so oftentimes, one of the ways that war can happen between great powers is if third parties or allies take an action that then is provocative. And so you're absolutely right in the sense that some of the islands in the South China Sea, so you look at the Senkaku or the Diaoyu Islands, which are basically rocks in the water. Well, Japan and China view that as very important to them because of the historic ties. But for the US, for us to go to war with China over that and risk nuclear war over rocks, I think doesn't make sense in terms of that, that chart that I had in terms of those circles. And so that's one way of looking at the problem. Then you'll have other people who make the counter argument. So I talked earlier about thinking of the opposite side. So you have other people who say, well, if you just make that argument and just let go of the issue, then you're basically appeasing China to then get more power. So then you could think of a way to kind of, I gave you the thesis, gave you the antithesis. The synthesis of that would be, well, your rhetoric could be about being strong and criticizing actions that, where China is going and building islands or interfering with the freedom of navigation, and you could make those criticisms. But in terms of the actual policy, in terms of sending ships there, in terms of threatening war, I think that might not work. So then doing something like that, where you're reassuring your ally without necessarily going to war, I think might be one way of tackling that. But again, that's just the idea out there. I have like, a lot longer views on that because it's a very complex topic, but that's like at a first blush how I'd go about like organizing thoughts on that.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool. Any other questions?
I just wanted to say thank you, Mr. Khalessi, for doing this presentation. We really appreciate it, and we're very proud of our alums and current students. Like Avi, I'm sure will come back in about 4 or 5 years, just like you, and he'll do a presentation for us, especially since I know how to track him down too.
Yeah, those were some really great questions. Thank you all.
I
another question as well, because I do debate as well, and we've been talking about cyber a lot. So I was curious, how do you think that cyber like attacks and potentially warfare might impact foreign policy, given how like different the dynamics are between that and conventional war or nuclear war in
Sorry,
terms of conflict, at least?
I got the end part about conventional war and nuclear war. I didn't hear the first half of your question. If you wouldn't mind repeating it. Thank you, Allison.
Yeah, Chris. I do debate as well, like Avi, and we've been talking about cyber a lot. So I
Cyber.
was curious how you think like cyber attacks and cyber conflict might impact foreign policy in the future, given how different it is from like conventional war and nuclear war in terms of like how countries attack and respond to each other.
Yeah, so cybersecurity, I think, is one of the toughest challenges because it has some similarities to Cold War balance of power relations, to nuclear weapons relationships between countries in terms of deterrence, but also a lot of differences because unlike nuclear weapons, which they're used to deter and then used for it can be used for war, and they would kill a lot of people presumably. With cyber security, there's so many different ways of actually using cyber weapons. So one is to go and actually launch a cyber attack that interferes with the country's financial system. There's others that go and you like launch an attack on a building that is critical infrastructure that results in something that would actually look like an armed attack. And so here the literature has actually been super fuzzy, but one professor who's actually gone and I think done an amazing job of organizing the thoughts on cybersecurity is Una Hathaway at Yale. She has a paper called The Law of Cyber Armed Conflict. I believe that's the title. And you can find it. I think the PDF of it is online, but she actually, I think one of the pages on that article has a diagram where she basically compares what is a cyber crime to what is a cyber attack to what is cyber warfare. And I think that's going to be a helpful formula to use in kind of diplomacy and foreign policy and thinking about kind of the terminology you use because, there's events that, where cyber weapons are used that fall short of war. And I think that's one issue. The other is attribution. So with nuclear weapons, with the exception of, let's say, like an accident or nuclear terrorism, with cybersecurity, oftentimes you'll have groups that are non-state actors that are like a cell where they're working and launching cyber attacks into a country. And it's hard to determine what the relationship is between that country and the government. So there you'd have to look at whether that group is getting specific instructions from that from the government or whether they're under like the general control of the government. So there are many different ways of thinking about this, but I definitely encourage you to look at Professor Hathaway's article from Yale, because I think that'll be helpful for you in debate.
Thank you. And yeah, I'll definitely check that out. It sounds really interesting.
Yeah. So any other questions? Yeah, if not, those were really wonderful questions. Thank you all so much for having me. Yeah, I'd like to thank Nancy and Laura and Jessica and all the administrators at Mountain View High School, and then all the wonderful teachers I had here. Thank you so much.